I work as a waitress at a diner, and I think one of our regulars might be the devil. I work at a rest stop diner in a town people pass through as quick as they can on their way to something or someone better. It's called Lucky's, which is a little ironic because if you've ended up here, you're anything but. If you stay too long, the dust settles. Working at Lucky's, you never see the same license plates twice, or faces for that matter. I've lost count of the amount of times the answer to my "where you heading" has been anywhere but back. The lights flicker more often than not, and the jukebox sometimes spits out songs that aren't on the index cards, but the coffee's hot, and most people who try them say the pancakes are the best they'll ever have, and I'm inclined to agree. The embroidered name tag on my uniform reads Isabella, but that ain't even close to my real name. It was my mom's. Lucky's has been here a long time. I wear it because I like hearing her name said by other people. It's like she's still here, still coming up in conversation. Like she might walk through the door any second and isn't buried in the cemetery just past the strip club. Lucky's is also always open. Always. Working long shifts serving drifters and truckers and runaways, those who have become impermanent out on the highways. You get to know how to read people pretty quick. When you move around that much, always on the road, you leave parts of yourself behind sometimes, lost between the miles. Sometimes people are just driving because there's nothing else left to do. Working at Lucky's, I've seen all sorts of lost things. I once saw a man hit a deer with his truck and pull over to bury it in the red dirt, digging as the sun went down, tears a steady flow down his face as he fought the ground to cover up what he had done. I once had a man I recognized from the news leave me a bloodstained $20 as a tip, sad-eyed in a denim jacket that barely hid the gun taped to his ribs. I once saw a one-armed girl no more than 16 stand up on the roof of her car and sing until a coyote came and sat in front of the hood howling along. I once saw two women fistfight in the parking lot in the night outside until one was spitting blood and teeth, and then they kissed in the blue lights of the police car that happened to pass them by, faces lit up red and shining. I've seen the highway on fire, lines of flames between tires as the asphalt set itself alight in the heat. I've seen roadside baptisms, preacher pulled up with a van and a kiddie pool. I've seen things walking out in the desert just beyond reach of the neon sign for the motel that don't look quite like people, shifting out in the blue night. I met a woman who showed me a photograph of the place she was buried. I often meet people who you talk with a while until their faces start to flicker, can't quite hold up the pretense that long. I've met people who have to be invited inside before they can cross the threshold. I've met some lovely members of a sacrificial cult who tipped well and were oh so polite, even when they asked me if I'd consider letting them harvest me. But this is a story about, well, you read the title. It was a Friday and I was working a night shift. I prefer nights, because when I drive home I can pretend for a while that I'm going to follow the taillights of the car in front until I leave everything in my rearview mirror, until it gets light and the desert changes to ocean. Like if I rolled my windows all the way down, I'd taste salt on the air. That, and I'm one of the only waitresses, shall we say, qualified to deal with the night customers. Besides, tips are always better when the moon is out. We only have 3 true regulars in Lucky's, and only 2 had showed so far. Rosemarie, our first and most frequent regular, was sat by the window in her brown fur coat, always drawn about her shoulders come rain or shine. Not that it ever rained here. Her hair was long and white down her back like the moon through a glass. She waved over to me, gracing me with a wink that made her crow's feet deepen, all the more beautiful for it. Rosemarie liked whiskey in her tea. Sometimes she fed cake crumbs to the voodoo dolls she carried in her pockets. She was also a chronic insomniac and liked the company of Lucky's when sleep was hiding from her. She continued to shuffle through the deck of cards she had already set up on the tabletop. I watched her thumbs flipping over 2 jokers. Rosemarie liked to divine the future when she had the time. She used a frayed pack of hotel playing cards, and if she was in a good mood, she'd read your coffee grounds. I didn't ask her too much because those coffee grounds had a startling way of coming true. Table 6 was empty and spotless as usual. It was the only table without a salt shaker and the only one I never placed cutlery on. Only one person ever sat there. Our second regular, Jones, was sat in his usual booth, dregs of his black coffee held tight between his hands, badge resting on the table. He had his eyes closed, head bent down like he was repenting, steam curling off the lip of the mug and wrapping around his fingers. Jones was my favorite of our customers, not that I'd ever tell him. I walked past the booth and slid a bowl of sugar packets along the tabletop until it hit the mug with a soft clink. He jumped, reaching for his holster out of habit, until his eyes focused and he saw me. He smiled, embarrassed, and it changed his face, dragging him back to life. When he smiled, it was like a storm in a drought, made you want to stand and watch, and maybe stay out in it just a while longer. I wanted to put my hands over his where they had resumed their place on the mug, to feel the second-hand heat through his palms. Sometimes I can sense the sad in people just by the feel of their skin. They carry it around with them, bone deep, trying to hide it from the world. But sometimes you can lift it from them for a minute or two, if you have enough kindness spare. It doesn't take much most times. Jones was too young to be that sad. And yet, tired today? I gestured with the coffee pot to his half-empty cup. Everyone knew about the little girl he'd pulled from the dumpsters outside the swimming pool last week. She was the fifth one missing in 3 months. I could tell from the shadows like purple thumbprints beneath his eyes he'd been dreaming about her. She'd been found without her shoes on. He'd carried her to the ambulance in her socks, pink with little daisies on them, small in his arms like she was asleep. Lou the fry cook had cried when I told him that the other day. I really liked Lou. He was almost too big to fit through the service door and had a tattoo of his dog just below the one of the angel of death on his shoulder. Lou sheds a tear for most things. The dead raccoons we're always finding by the back door with their hands missing. Whenever there's a new missing poster plastered over the cracked glass of the phone booth in the parking lot. Every time he hears "I will forever hate roses" when it decides to pop up on the jukebox. Big guy, bigger heart. Always tired, Jones said as I poured. Another girl had gone missing yesterday. As I poured, I made sure to brush his thumb where it rested on the cup handle with the inside of my wrist, lifting out that sadness as far as I could. He smiled up at me, shy. And I smiled back before I could stop myself. I walked onto the next booth, 2 truckers with faces that had seen too much sun. One was showing the other the photos of his new baby in his wallet. He had tobacco-stained teeth, a scab on his cheek, and wind-chapped lips. And his smile was the most beautiful damn thing as he talked about his kid, lit up like Christmas morning. He showed me too as I refilled his coffee, and I stayed and talked to them a while. The other trucker with gold-back teeth told me how he'd used to drive pigs, but couldn't handle the guilt when he handed them over to the slaughterhouse. Said he'd look right into their pink faces through the slats, and their eyes looked right back, bright and pleading like they knew what he'd done. Said he still dreamt about them. Now he drove freezers of seafood, specialty deliveries for fancy hotels. He'd never seen the ocean. Lou slammed the bell from the depths of the kitchen and I got back to work, taking orders from a woman with a Labrador who ordered hot dogs for them both, and 3 teenage boys in their blood-stained varsity jackets in the corner who had $10 between them and asked for as many waffles as they could get. They often came in on full moons, leaving their bikes chained up in the parking lot. They were always hunting something, with their baseball bats, backpacks filled with bullets, and their daddy's guns, But they were nice kids, so I always gave them extra scoops of ice cream. Besides, I knew they needed the energy because when they were hunting, they had to run fast, real fast. There used to be four of them. I cleared the table from the two women at the next booth on my way back. They looked to be twins, both dressed in long silk skirts and hiking boots, red hair piled up messy on top of their heads. Neither acknowledged me, not out of rudeness, but because they were too preoccupied, packing up their bags, overspilling with maps and notebooks. I spied a roll of duct tape and a bottle of vodka in there too, along with some stakes and crucifixes. They were deep in conversation, waving their hands, and I caught a little of it as I stacked their empty glasses, lipsticked around the rims. I know where I buried him, Sylvia. You don't know jack shit. We dug for hours, and my mom always taught me eavesdropping was rude, so I left them to it and headed into the kitchen. But I got the sense that wherever they had left whoever he was, he certainly wasn't there no more. I felt like telling them, but like my mom said, it's not polite to listen to other people's conversations. You never know what you'll wish you hadn't heard. Lou was dancing to the radio, swaying his hips to Sugar Hill as Dolly sang down the wires. He waved at me with the spatula he was using as a microphone. Carlos handed me a plate of pancakes. Carlos had worked here so long he'd known my mom, and was the only one who knew my real name. He sometimes came with me on the weekends to change the flowers on her grave. He always brought her desert flowers, growing from the same earth she was. Carlos was also the only one who knew the recipe for the Lucky's pancakes and the only one that could cook them right. On days when he wasn't working, we had no pancakes. Simple as. That was just the way it went. I'd learnt that the hard way, but that's another story. Along with the pancakes came a warning. He's back. He gestured through the doors. Table 6. Our final regular had showed. It had been a while since he'd been around. I hadn't even seen him come in, but that wasn't unusual. He moved in mysterious ways. I raised an eyebrow. Shit. Carlos raised one back. Oh, shit. He tossed me the salt with a grimace, and I filled the pockets of my apron. Lou banged around in one of the staff lockers for a moment until he emerged triumphant, waving a Bible that had definitely seen better days. He placed in on the counter next to the syrup jugs and flipped to a random page. We leant over his huge shoulders to read what it said. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. Lou shrugged and patted me on the shoulder. I don't get paid enough for this shit. I took the pancakes to table 6, which had been empty the last time I'd looked. It was now very much occupied. The man sat at table 6 was smiling as I walked over, if you could call it a smile. It was more like rictus, lips straining deep red at the corners of his face. His eyes kept darting from side to side, too fast to count, like his pupils couldn't make up their mind where they should be. His hands shook as I got closer, hovering like flies on a carcass. I tried to lean as far away from him as I could as I placed the plate on the tabletop, but as I pulled my hands away, he darted his neck out fast, whipping his head up and tilting his face towards me. He sniffed in, hard, eyelids fluttering. He giggled, shrill like it was stuck on the roof of his mouth. I recoiled, trying to hide the urge I had to run back to the kitchen. There's something about hearing a grown man giggle that makes the skin crawl. Can I get you anything? I asked, faking bright. I'd take your name. He gripped one of the pancakes in his fist, turning it to mush. I tapped the name tag on my uniform. He shook his head, grinning, shoulders almost vibrating with this strange fluid roll as his smile slipped for a second, front teeth jutting suddenly, tongue sharply poking out. Filth was caked under his nails, red like the dirt on the sides of the road. Then he was smiling again, swaying slowly from side to side, feral, in his hunting jacket. His hair hung in greasy strings around his ears like blonde rat tails, and they swung with him back and forth. Isabella. Isabella, Isabella, it don't suit. He suddenly slammed his hand up to his face, shoveling the crushed pancake into the gaping hole of his wide mouth. I jerked back. The movement was so sudden. I shoved my hands into my apron, reaching for the salt, and his eyes narrowed. "There's no need for that," came a voice from behind me. It rolled across my shoulders deep to the bone. "Mr. Prince." I turned to face our third regular, relief mixing with fear and a swirling pit in my chest. Kind of like that feeling you get at a fairground in midsummer when you've been on a carousel too long, and part of you knows you need to get off, but the other part doesn't want to leave because, as soon as you stand still, you're going to be sick. Mr. Prince had that effect on people. Mr. Prince was dressed, as always, in his black pinstripe. His Stetson was darker than the night outside, and his boots shone like they were wet. If you didn't notice the upside-down crucifixes embroidered daintily onto his custom lapels, you'd think he was just a man with money, maybe mixed up in something a little shady like oil or pharmaceuticals. He was handsome by the way of his jaw with his bone-white smile, but his black sunglasses were balanced on the bridge of his nose, silver-rimmed and gleaming, hiding his eyes as usual. When he spoke, it was a drawl, dragged up from the depths of the South. "I'm sorry for my acquaintance. He's a little—" Mr. Prince glanced at the man sat at table 6 as he panted with his tongue hung out like a dog. Overexcited. Mr. Prince sat down and the lights above the booth flickered. He tilted his hat back on his head and the jukebox coughed and skipped. And suddenly Robert Johnson was on and singing about that damn crossroad again. Mr. Prince popped a Marlboro Red between his teeth and pushed the window open a sliver with the knuckles of his left hand. The silver pentagram ring on his wedding finger clacked against the glass. Mr. Prince smiled the way snakes do when they're watching you from the grass on their bellies. The cigarette was now smoking between his teeth, although he hadn't moved. Besides, Leroy ain't the type for salt. He's just a man. He looked him up and down, and his top lip curled. Barely. He turned to Leroy. "I see you started on my pancakes, but what's the point of good food if it ain't for sharing?" Leroy giggled that strange high sound that made me want to run and shook a little. Everything about Leroy made me nervous, fight or flight getting ready to flood my system. Mr. Prince handed Leroy a menu. "Order whatever you want." He leant forward and the lights flickered. Leroy ordered 4 cheeseburgers and glass of milk. "Well, if that's all," I managed. I could feel Leroy's eyes clinging to my back as I left. Rosemarie waved me over before I could get back to the safety of the kitchen. "I wouldn't worry about him, darling." She crossed herself and tapped the card on top of the pile. The Jack of Spades. It had its eyes scratched out, but not by Rosemarie. It looked like it had been printed that way for years. We won't be seeing him again. She wasn't talking about Mr. Prince. She cupped my cheek and I leant into it, her hand rough with age, but warm. I could tell she thought I looked tired. She paid for her tea and toast and walked out into the warm night waiting outside the doors. I finally made it back into the kitchen and was immediately attacked. Cold water doused me in the face and I threw up my arms on instinct, trying to protect my hair. Lou aggressively squirted me in the face with the spray bottle we also kept in the staff locker, the kind you use for tending houseplants. Ours was filled with holy water. "Lou, Jesus fucking Christ, get off him!" I sputtered, and he sprayed me again. I spat holy water out, dripping down the front of my dress and wiped it from my eyes, makeup running a little. I grabbed the bottle from his hands. "I think I'm good." I wasn't really mad, though. Better safe than sorry, especially when it comes to possession. Sorry, just checking. Lou sheepishly handed me a dish towel. Already did me in Carlos. He looked down at his shoes, awkward. He was a foot taller than me and a decade older, and I hid my smile because he was twisting the toe of his boot back and forth like a little kid been kept after class. Carlos kept his eyes firmly fixed on his hands as he started flipping patties, but I could sense him holding back a laugh, desperately clenching his teeth. I narrowed my eyes and aimed the spray bottle at him. Maybe you need some more, I threatened. Lou snorted, and then Carlos was laughing, and I was too, and that heavy feeling that had hovered over us since Mr. Prince had walked in lifted. Sometimes when things get too dark, all you can do is laugh. Mom always said that when shit gets rough, you can either choose to laugh or cry. I never saw my mother cry. It was coming up on 3 in the morning as I took the burgers back to table 6. Leroy visibly drooled and clapped his hands as I walked over. I put the plate in front of him as quick as I could, but as I pulled back, his head darted forward and he licked the inside of my wrist. His tongue was long and wet against my pulse. I recoiled like I'd been bitten, and he laughed, shrill and manic. "You taste better than they will," he said, grinning and gesturing to the burgers. Mr. Prince watched this unfold, calm and unreadable like the sky before summer lighting burns down a tree. I frantically wiped my arm on my apron, but I could still feel that tongue on my skin as if I'd left my hand in his mouth. I fought off the tears that suddenly burned at the corners of my eyes because something told me Leroy would enjoy them just a little too much. I shuddered and cleared Mr. Prince's plate. "Tell Carlos the pancakes were good as hell," he said from behind his sunglasses. Then he chuckled, low and raspy, as if something he'd said was funny. He popped another Marlboro between his teeth and it started to glow as Leroy shoveled meat down his throat. I tried not to gag as I watched it clog beneath his long nails. I walked by Jones on my way back. He waved me over, eyes creased with worry. He ran a hand over his face as if he was trying to wipe all the bad things away. "Is he bothering you?" He gestured over to Leroy, who was rocking back and forth, drinking his milk. Jones suddenly looked so tired, uniform creased as his face, looking 50 instead of his 22. "Nothing I can't handle." I shook my head and thought about Rosemarie. We won't be seeing him again. It felt like hours waiting for Leroy to finish. I took the order of a man with a butterfly tattooed on his neck and some truckers pouring Jim Beam into their coffee. They asked me for an extra cup, which they placed at the empty seat on their table for absent friends, they said. I cleaned down the countertop, restocked the sugar packets, and took out the trash, ignoring the man in the rabbit mask that often waits out by the dumpsters. As long as you don't look at him, he doesn't bother you. I refilled coffee cups and took the orders of the large group of biker girls that came in, leather-clad and road-weary. At 3:03 a.m., Mr. Prince stood. Leroy had licked his plate clean and was sitting still, staring up at him with his teeth bared in a smile, hands gripping the tabletop so hard his knuckles were going white as milk. Mr. Prince handed me a roll of bills wrapped in black plastic that I knew better than to count. He tipped his hat. "See, Leroy, we all gotta pay eventually," he said. He leaned in and spoke softly. "For I will not acquit the wicked," he smiled. He held out his hand to Leroy, palm flat, waiting. Leroy's hand shook as he reached into his hunting jacket and pulled out a pair of shoes. A child's shoes, small enough that both could fit in one hand. Little pink sneakers, dirty, with brown stains on the toes that I knew could only be one thing. Mr. Prince considered them a moment under the lights and shook his head. He seemed like he was sorry before he handed them to me. "For your man over there, tell him to dig deeper where they looked last. He nodded to Jones, who was watching us, his badge gripped in his hand, but Jones knew better than to come over. Mr. Prince turned to Leroy and grinned around his cigarette. "We've got a ways to go. The road we're taking. They say it's paved with good intentions." He chuckled, and I felt sick to my stomach. He took Leroy's hand like a child, and they walked out into the night, warm and waiting. The door swung shut behind them, even though nobody had touched them. The jukebox sputtered, and Chris Rea was on, singing about that road again. I placed the shoes on the table by Jones' empty coffee cup and passed on the message. He sat still for a long time after, just watching them on the tabletop, trying not to cry or scream or punch a hole in the plaster. All I could do was refill his coffee, because when someone is trying to hold themselves together like that, there's nothing left to say. My shift ended and I drove myself home following the taillights in front of me. I knew when I woke up it would be dark and it would be time for my next shift. But for now, I just drove, dreaming about the ocean and watching the sun come up, like it always does, despite everything. Story 2. I work as a waitress, part-time. It doesn't particularly matter where I work or whether or not you know, but I'd rather not be specific, just in case. Sometimes you need to indulge your sense of paranoia. Sometimes the smallest thing can get you into a lot of trouble, and I'd like to keep this job even if the pay is shit. Let's just say that it's a chain restaurant that likes to pretend it's a fun place to bring your family and friends, and it's one that people love to hate. That doesn't narrow it down, but you get the idea of what the place is like. It's the type of place where the patrons forget you're a human being, the managers just barely count as human beings, and the hours are somehow too little to pay the bills and too much to have anything resembling a normal social life. But if you're a college student or a recent college graduate, you know the drill. You study for 4 years or so, take out loans the whole time to pay tuition, work your ass off to afford textbooks and food, graduate broke, and then find out that your degree doesn't mean anything as far as your job prospects are concerned. Or else you're like me, waiting on a callback from graduate school so that hard-won bachelor's degree will one day mean something. That's why I've got this job, and it's a far cry from what I wanted to be doing with my life right now. I went to school for psychology. I want to be a psychologist. I got decent grades. And here I am bringing crayons to screaming children while their parents stare at their phones. Anyway, on to the interesting stuff. Who wants to listen to someone complaining about the boring, annoying things that happen at work? I don't, and I picked a potential career that entails listening to people talk about their problems. Most people don't want to hear the boring minutia, so I'll tell you about some of the customers I've seen and had to deal with. The restaurant I work at is in a college town. Again, I'm not going to be specific here. Let me play at doctor-patient confidentiality, since at this point in my life, this is the closest I'll get. Just picture your typical semi-rural college town. Shiny, overpriced dorm halls and academic buildings near the bars and strip malls. Increasingly dilapidated and abandoned local businesses the further out you go. There's a lot of drugs around here, a lot of closet alcoholics, a lot of major depressives, and families too poor to afford proper medical and psychiatric care for their family members. Economically, the place is shot, which only adds to the problems with drugs, mental illness, crime, etc. You can imagine what this means for the type of customers we get at ye olde unnamed chain restaurant. I work afternoons and weeknights, which is when the odd things happen. People have given their 10-year-old children a wad of singles and let them walk in, completely unsupervised. Drug addicts come in and to use the bathroom to cook and shoot up. I've had men twice my age tell me that they've seen me in Playboy while I'm trying to take their orders. And no, that's not a compliment, but you have to smile and pretend that you're not disgusted by the things they're saying to you. I like to treat it as practice for when I'm a therapist. That's what gets me through the shifts. This isn't exactly professional of me, but another thing I like to do is try to diagnose the customers, the ones that seem off somehow, with my admittedly limited diagnostic knowledge. Is it fair of me? Not really, but you have to amuse yourself somehow. The way I see it, if we get someone who quietly talks to themselves instead of ordering or who seems to be in the middle of a manic upswing, it's better than another creepy old man who unironically refers to himself as daddy in conversation. While I take their order and bring them drinks and avoid thinking about how I'm supposedly living the best years of my life right now, I'll silently go through DSMV criteria in my head and try to pin down what's going on with this particular person. I really like abnormal psychology, what can I say? One day I'll be a therapist, and the chain restaurant that shall not be named gets some real characters. One time we had a woman bring a cat in her purse. She just walked in, bundled up in an old coat that reeked of cigarettes, and got seated with a live animal tucked in her bag. The hostess was too busy to pay attention. She should have been fired, but she was friendly with the manager on duty at the time. It took an hour of this woman sneaking the cat pieces of chicken strips to keep it quiet before one of the servers noticed. She responded to the request for her to leave by screaming about discrimination against service animals, spitting on the table, and finally upending her bag. Not only was there a cat in there, which ran into the kitchen and nearly gave one of the cooks a TIA, but there was a layer of used napkins, a dozen sugar packets, a Tupperware container of dirty needles, and a kitten in there too. A dead kitten. We had to close down and deep clean before we got coded. That woman was a textbook hoarder, possibly STPD, possibly an addict. Other times they're less subtle. One time an older gentleman came in. I won't say his name. He tipped well. But once you talked to him for a few minutes, it became clear that he was delusional. I don't mean this in the pop culture schizophrenic way, but in the sense that he was completely convinced that the town is secretly being watched by men in black with drones and hidden cameras, that local members of public office are regularly replaced with clones that have secret agendas, and that they come to him in the night to keep him from leaving and spreading the truth. I might write about this man later. He was incredible. I listened to him and nodded, then brought him a blue steak. It's incredibly unprofessional of me to do this, I know. But the stranger the customer, the more fun I have. It's low-budget professional development. Not only that, but they make for great stories when I manage to spend time with friends. It's therapeutic for me, ironically enough. If a customer is especially troubling or manages to really creep me out, I can describe their unsettling behavior clinically or else laugh about it with friends over a glass of Franzia. There's one story that I don't really tell, though, not to friends or family. This one I remember especially since it's so interesting. I have my tentative diagnosis and even a bit of investigation I did afterwards that backs up my suspicions, but to this day I'm not quite sure what happened. This one actually got police involvement, but I won't name names. I have to be professional after all. I have to respect privacy. But after I'm done telling it, you'll hopefully understand why this story is so interesting. There are things about it that I can't explain, even with undergrad psychology. This man came in while I was working an afternoon shift. Typically, there's a lunch rush at 12, a smaller rush around 3 o'clock, and then a dead time until 5 or 6 when the dinner crowd comes. After that, it's busy until at least 10, so you get into the habit of using the quieter times to do prep work. I was folding napkins when this man walked in. He looked normal, nondescript height and weight, short hair, jeans, red t-shirt peeking through where his denim jacket wasn't buttoned. He wandered to a booth by the door and sat down without a word. The hostess working at the time is my friend. She's a nice person, almost too sweet for words, but she's got anxiety and I'm pretty sure she has codependent tendencies, if not DPD. Sorry, Frankie, but it's true. When the man blows off her canned greeting, she got freaked out, More than she should have, I thought at the time. We exchanged mutual, what the hell, great, another one, looks, and I perked up, expecting another meth head or narcissist to talk to, but for some reason my friend decided to check on the man herself. She's been working at El Shane food vendor a lot longer than I have, so she's used to strange things even if she ends every shift on the verge of stress tears. She's a trooper, even if she's constantly emotionally exhausted by her job. So I'm not too surprised when she minces over to talk to the man. But just to be safe, out of waitstaff solidarity, I guess, I watch them as I'm wrapping forks in paper napkins. The hostess walked over, repeating her greeting and asking if the man was waiting for someone. Sometimes that happens. People sit down because they think their party's been seated already, and it's irritating for whoever's blocking tables, but usually fixed pretty quickly. This particular man didn't seem to be waiting for anyone, though. In fact, he seemed barely aware of his surroundings. I don't mean in your typical distracted way, but in a measurable Glasgow coma scale way. He stared ahead, across the tops of the other booths, right at the wall. His hands were palm down on the table, relaxed. I wish I could have seen what was under his fingernails. He just kept staring ahead at the beige wall. His eyes seemed not glazed, not hazy, but curiously blank. When the hostess slid a menu onto the table, he looked down at it, following the motion of the laminate in a slow, dreamlike way, and then finally looked up and made eye contact. His pupils looked normal, not blown or uneven like TBI or pinprick like you see with heroin. He didn't respond verbally. I'd have given him a V on the AVPU, but just barely. This isn't a professional description, but he looked like his brain was buffering, like a YouTube video still loading. You got the sense somehow that you weren't looking at a real person but a cardboard placeholder for someone sitting in a booth in a restaurant. My hostess friend, bless her heart, kept trying to talk to him. I could tell she really wanted to get out of there, so she asked if he wanted coffee as a last attempt to get something out of him. The man responded to that surprisingly. To be precise, when my friend asked, "Do you want a coffee?" he said, "Coffee," and mimicked her tone. That's called echolalia, just so you know. Then, clumsily, almost puppet-like, he reached into the pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out a handful of coins, still looking at her. Then his head smoothly turned to face the wall again, and he kept staring. Later on, as it turned out, the coins he spilled all over the tabletop counted up to the exact change needed to pay for the single coffee he ordered. That's one of the small details that makes me wonder. It could be coincidence or him already knowing how much a coffee at Family Calorie Hut costs, but that doesn't seem right. He hadn't been there before, as I'll explain in a bit, and he stared at the menu for barely a second. So either he was a speed reader, very lucky with change, or something else. I got up to pour the coffee. I wanted to see this guy close up since he seemed interesting, and my friend stopped me. She whispered at me not to go. "Just don't," she said, and then disappeared into the back. At the time, I blew her off. In hindsight, I probably should have listened to her. I brought him the coffee, and that placeholder feeling only got stronger. I'm rambling, but I really need to impress upon you how odd the situation was before I get to the most interesting details. Something was missing. There's a particular level of alertness that you look for when you communicate with another person, even with a language barrier or other factors involved. Subconsciously, you look for micro-expressions, minuscule motions of the brows and mouth and other muscles that show that you're cognizant and alert to your surroundings. Some people have difficulty showing micro-expressions. That's where we get the uncanny valley effect from, among other things. But there's still something there in the face and eyes when you talk to someone. There was nothing there with this man. It was like talking to a doll made out of human flesh, something fake. The next interesting thing I noticed was the smell about him. Those of you that are either of the female persuasion or grew up around women are probably familiar with the smell old period blood gets after a while. If you hunt, you might also know the smell of old blood. There was that smell around him, not strong, but there. Underlying that was the smell of ammonia, also faint. On its own, it might be something to joke about. This wasn't the first person to come in and smell like blood or piss, after all. But combined with the blankness, I was inexplicably afraid. I found myself genuinely wondering if something had happened to his man, or if he'd done something. But I'm used to smiling and nodding, so, like a good pre-therapist, I tried to strike up a conversation. "How was your day?" "Day," he replied, echolalia again, and then he slid the coffee towards himself and picked it up. He held the mug in his hand, upright by his mouth, but didn't drink. It was strange. It was like watching someone pretend to drink coffee. "How was your day?" he asked me. I said it was going fine. "Fine," he said. "You're fine." The way he said it wasn't meant as a question. It didn't sound like "you're fine," but like "you're" and then "fine" edited together. That's not what echolalia should be. What could have sounded like a bad attempt at a pickup line sounded instead like someone awkwardly constructing human speech out of audio samples, and the whole time he kept staring ahead in that odd pose. It wasn't normal, and it wasn't normal abnormal either. I need to make that clear. He didn't fit the criteria for anything I knew. I had no DSMV for this man. That was when I noticed that his shirt wasn't totally red. The way he was holding the coffee mug, his jacket had hitched up on that side, revealing a small patch of white by his collar. That patch of white made me look at the red blotch in the center. Pattern recognition made me do it, I guess you could say. The red and white almost like Rorschach blots. I had thought was the shirt's color. I thought it was a maroon shirt that was dirty and completely overlooked something that seems obvious now. It was like the hostess and that woman with the cat in her purse. "Is that blood?" The man stared at me, coffee motionless by his mouth, and I'll admit that I might have sounded a bit hysterical. "What is that? Is that blood?" The man looked down at himself and my eyes followed. I noticed that there was a patch of red on the fabric of the booth seat, too. It was coming from his pocket. Something was seeping through the fabric of his jeans, covered by the jacket, but the shirt had soaked it up. That's why it was red, but I find it difficult to care about the shirt. Because after that, there was a flash of something on the man's face. A micro-expression finally got through, something clicked, and the placeholder sensation vanished. Now, though, I had a man covered in blood sitting in a booth in front of me. You can probably imagine that this didn't calm me down much. The man, though, he was still calm and confused as he placed the coffee cup down and reached into his pocket. I didn't understand what I was looking at first when he pulled it out. I've seen some weird things while waitressing, but surprisingly, I've never had a gun pulled on me. What I have seen, however, is a man pull half of a fresh human jawbone out of his pants pocket and stare at it like he had no idea how it got there. I'm not joking. Now I can say with certainty what a human jawbone looks like. The teeth give it away after a few seconds, but when you see one for the first time, you're confused. What's this shiny, clumpy red thing you're looking at? What are those clean white parts sticking out of it? Why is it so frightening to look at? It doesn't process. It didn't process for him either. That's the detail that makes this so interesting. That's what I keep thinking about. The jawbone with its clean teeth and the expression on his face. I kept saying that there was nothing on this man's face, nothing there, and it's important you realize that because it makes you understand what it was like to see it all come crashing back in. Out of the blankness, maybe from mirroring me, echolalia of expression, came a growing, terrible look of confusion and horror. He held that jawbone, stared at it, and then stared at me. He didn't know what was going on then, what it was, or how it had gotten there. but I watched his expression slowly change as he came to understand that something terrible had happened to him. The police came about 10 minutes later, straight from the precinct near the college. The man was handcuffed and taken away. Later, as it turned out, he was identified. I won't name names, I have to preserve confidentiality, but he'd been missing for a full year and had somehow, inexplicably, turned up in the shitty chain restaurant where I worked despite being last seen halfway across the country. One day this man vanished and showed up a year later with no memory of where he was, who he was, or how and why he had half a woman's jawbone in his pocket. I had to find out more, of course. The official explanation was dissociative fugue. That would explain a lot. Fugue states are a personal interest of mine, especially now, and they explain what happened. One day, a complex neurological process renders you unsure of your identity and destination, and you wander and travel in a deeply dissociated state, doing things you normally wouldn't do, until something happens to either bring you out of it or you're found and identified. It's uncanny, but it makes sense. The odd behavior, the staring, the echolalia, those are mostly explained by dissociative fugue. The man was sent home, I think, to reunite with his family. He didn't live anywhere near the restaurant. I learned more about what happened to him after that. I've even talked to him when memories started to be remade, but I shouldn't say more. I should respect his privacy and leave the whole affair alone. It makes for a great story, and maybe one day I'll do my doctoral thesis on fugue states. But that's the end of it. It's the little details, though, that make it hard to stop thinking about. What doesn't quite make sense is the jawbone, not only the fact it existed at all, but where it came from. They identified it from DNA and partial dental records, and it apparently came from a mother of two that had gone missing almost 5 years before that man did, presumed dead. That woman had been missing for 6 years. She'd gone missing in a different part of the country than the man, and she wasn't from around here either. But somehow part of her jaw wound up in his pocket, and it was still fresh. I don't know if it all adds up. I can't stop thinking about it. This story, and all the other ones like it. I won't lie, I was very surprised by the response I got when I posted my anecdotes. I was hoping that someone would find them interesting, but I didn't expect so many upvotes and comments. Thank you. I hope you understand that I can't be specific about what happened after that man was taken away by the police. Not only is there still an investigation into the jawbone and the woman it belonged to, meaning that giving away too much detail might land me in legal trouble, but that man is a real person with very real problems he's trying to cope with. His life has been irrevocably changed, and it's hard not to feel for him despite that first interaction involving him being covered in blood and holding human remains. As a therapist, you have to learn to distance yourself from who you're observing without losing your ability to sympathize. You can't have emotional mirroring, but you need to have empathy. If you don't have that, why are you doing the job? Anyway, the man was identified, like I said, and went home to his family. I was interviewed by police along with my hostess friend and the few patrons present at the time. None of us had much to say, but that's standard police procedure from what I know. We were discouraged from going to the media. I got my hours docked for the rest of the week, but that's management for you. Luckily, I'd already paid rent. I spent the next few weeks going through my notes from PSY 330 and reading up on fugue states and amnesiac murders, but there's only so much speculation you can do on a roughly 10-minute encounter. Without field data, there's no use theorizing. That's just bad science. You can imagine how I felt then, when one of the weekday managers pulled me to the side a few months later and told me that someone had called Orange Wednesday Pear Pepper Restaurant to see if I was still working there. At the time, I had gone through a bad breakup with a clingy boyfriend, so I told the manager to tell my ex to leave me alone. "It's not him," she'd said. "It's the guy from the news, the guy with the, you know." She tapped her jaw. I must have had an odd look on my face. I try to be especially aware of my facial expressions now, after seeing how disturbing it is to not have any, and my manager assured me that she would call the police. Maybe that would have been the wisest thing to do, but I told her not to. If it really was the man with the bloody shirt, I reasoned, he should be halfway across the country. He might be calling me to jog his memory or get closure. Either way, there was no harm in talking to him on the phone. I know how that sounds, but keep in mind that I want to help people one day. I might like observing and diagnosing, but the end goal in all of that is to help people. So I picked up the phone and said hello. His voice sounded human this time. There wasn't too much of a change in pitch or speed, but hearing him using words put together organically and knowingly was a lot less disquieting than that bizarre echolalia was. There was a stiff formality there, but it was what you'd expect, given the circumstances. "Are you the waitress?" he asked. Part of me was glad that he hadn't found out my name. I told him that I was and asked how he had been. That seemed to put him a little at ease, because that job interview tone quickly evaporated. He apologized for upsetting me, which really says something about his character, or at least his sense of personal responsibility, and asked me for some peculiar details surrounding the time he walked in and the condition he was in. I wasn't able to talk to him for very long. I was graciously afforded my legally mandated break for this. But after some deliberation, I gave him a throwaway email address so we could keep in touch. Once again, I know how that might seem. I regretted doing it as soon as I hung up the phone. Nowadays, though, I'm glad that I did. You see, part of why he was calling me wasn't simply to apologize, or even to touch base with the first person he saw when he snapped out of a dissociative episode. That would have been frankly fucking fascinating as it is. But the real reason was interesting for a different reason. As we communicated through email, it became clear that he was double-checking that the details of the case were really as they were reported. I won't be specific as to what was in question, but he had a lingering doubt that certain details were being misrepresented. When the evidence was taken and he was questioned, he was still confused on time and place. Now that he had gone home for the first time in a year, he found it difficult to ease back into the life he'd left behind. Something still seemed off. I thought he was still suffering from lingering psychological issues. There's oftentimes a mismatch in memory that occurs when recovering from a fugue, where things don't seem as they should be. It's a symptom of a brain attempting to heal itself as neurological function returns to normal when the actual nerves and brain matter start to recover. Likewise, family members and friends may find it difficult to reconcile the version of you they'd been holding on to with the person you've become as a result of whatever caused the fugue state. It's a sad truth that, in many missing persons cases, even going home again doesn't mean that everything can return to normal. There are lingering traumas and maladaptive behaviors that arise, and it would make sense if it was because of that. I was a little surprised when I was contacted by the police, who had somehow caught wind of the phone call. Officially, I was told that they were concerned for my personal safety. I reassured them that I didn't feel like I was in danger, that I'd inform them if anything unusual or disturbing occurred, and that I would of course cease contact with the man. I'm not sure why I didn't do that. It might have something to do with the fact that this was a real-life case on a topic I'm professionally and personally interested in. It might have something to do with the fact that this was a real way for me to act as a therapist, even if I wasn't certified. I could actually investigate and interview someone who had abnormal psychology beyond asking them questions between appetizer orders. Or it might have had something to do with the particular double click I heard when they hung up the phone, the kind that's easily explained with static if you're not paranoid. I'll leave it at that, since that's really as much as I'm comfortable with saying right now. I should point out that this isn't the first time that someone's gone missing and turned up around here. Over the years, there have been at least a half-dozen cases of missing persons either turning themselves into the local police or being found in the vicinity of the town I live and work in. Hearing that, it might be tempting to assume that there's a sinister cause. Alien abduction is a common theory, as well as mysterious beings in the nearby mountains, serial killers who like to hunt their prey like wild game. I try to be logical and look at those claims with a clinical, detached eye. That'll be my job as a therapist one day, to take a distorted line of thinking and gently guide it back to reality. So, no, I don't believe in aliens. I might have once, but I stopped considering that as a logical explanation long before that man showed up, or I noticed any of the other unusual things about this town. Honestly, it's probably because of the location. Without being too specific, the chain restaurant that shall not be named is right next to a college, near a train station, and there's even an old military base you can visit if you don't mind driving on winding country roads and staring at abandoned buildings behind barbed wire. All of those things draw people in, and confirmation bias takes care of the rest. Of course, you'll notice a missing persons case when you've already heard of the last 5 times an amnesiac randomly came into town. Disappearances and mysterious reappearances are surprisingly common in everyday life. We just don't hear about them, or, ironically, we forget about them if we do. It's surprisingly easy to lose track of things. Here's an example. The local franchise of Box Food Central that pays my bills has a budget set aside exclusively for lost or stolen objects. Silverware, glassware, and food product has mysteriously gone missing, so often that the management started setting aside funds devoted exclusively to replacing whatever's gone this week. It's a strange thing about this place, but it's something you have to get used to. This town has a lot of drug addicts, and if you're desperate enough, you'll steal anything in the hopes of pawning it to buy your specific poison of choice. We've even had a few of those call-a-server devices go missing, to the delight of all the waitstaff. I wasn't on shift when that happened, but management was pissed. Still, what can you do but dip into the disappeared objects fund and get a new one from Central? None of them are going to turn up anytime soon. There's been another reappearance fairly recently, as it turns out. It's been almost a year since the incident with the man and the jawbone happened. This case is from about 2 months ago. It's been permanently closed, so I can talk about it. This one is just as unsettling as the first one, but it's also heartbreaking. There was a call placed from the local train station in the early morning. I'm not sure when, but it had to have been after 6 a.m. A woman who had been seen wandering on a local road walked in, disheveled and glassy-eyed, and attempted to buy a train ticket to New York City. For some reason, the station doesn't actually sell train tickets. You have to buy them online, print them, and then have them stamped at the station. It's a major inconvenience, but it might have something to do with how small it is. When the rather tired teller told her this fact, the woman pulled money out of her pocket and set it neatly down on the counter. The teller repeated that he couldn't sell tickets, and when the woman didn't stop asking, told her in rather rude terms to go home and sober up or else buy the ticket on her cell phone. Still, she stood there, nudging a crumpled wad of bills at the increasingly aggravated teller until he finally realized how out of sorts she seemed and connected the dots. You might be wondering, yes, I checked. And yes, it was exact change. Strange, isn't it? It's another detail that makes what could have been yet another forgotten missing persons case stick in my mind. It could be confirmation bias, or maybe it's a protective mechanism to write this off as extraneous detail. According to the teller, she'd pulled out an even wad of bills that just so happened to add up to what it would have cost to buy a train ticket. It could have been that she was just carrying that amount on her. If that was the case, I wish I had that kind of disposable income. Police were called. In the time it took for them to arrive, the teller did his best to help the woman, who seemed fixated on buying a train ticket until abruptly seeming to come to and realize that she was lost. You may notice a pattern here. When informed where she was, the woman was lost for words and began to cry quietly, staying huddled in the corner of the waiting area beyond consolation until the police had to physically remove her to take her to the precinct. She wasn't the woman reported missing from the previous story. She still had an intact jaw. The standard battery of tests were performed: toxicology screening, psychological evaluation, rape kit, but as far as I know, there wasn't anything of interest found. I don't exactly make a habit of asking the police for details as much as I take a personal interest in these cases. I heard from someone I know who works at the hospital they brought her to that there was extensive scarring around her torso, scarring from a healed abrasion, as if she'd been in a car accident and gotten severe road rash. That would explain the physical evidence, as well as her missing time. The important thing isn't the physical scarring. The thing that should alarm you is the fact that the woman committed suicide a month after being found. Remember what I said about lingering traumas? How, even after identity returns, there may never be full recovery of lost memory? How sometimes, no matter how hard you try to acclimate, things never go back to how they were before. In the 6 months since this woman had vanished while driving to visit family, her whole life had fallen apart. I don't know the details, but from gossip and news reports I've gathered that she was due to be married. It's always something like that, isn't it? When she vanished, her fiancé had gone into a spiral and died in some form of car accident, a DWI or similar. I don't know about her home life, not yet anyway, but that kind of loss makes recovery arduous at best. She died from some form of drug overdose, just like too many people around here. The case is closed now. I think that's enough for now. I wanted to tell more stories, but I can't stop thinking about how much that woman must have suffered. To come out of a fog, to realize you've lost months of your life and you have no idea what you've done, to wake up with scarring you can't remember getting, and then learn that the loved one you remember from what may feel like yesterday is gone forever. It's difficult to be professional about that. I'll admit that I have more than a little self-interest going into this. But still, I need to be as impartial as possible and figure out what it means. If anyone has any ideas, please share them. But for now, I'm going to stop here. Next segment will contain more scattered stories. I'll tell you about things that have happened around here that are less tragic but still bizarre. Story 3. It was July 27th, 1967. And we were traveling from Michigan to Ottawa to see our old friend Ray Terry. It was around a 9-hour drive in Donnie's Impala. We hadn't seen Ray since high school graduation 8 years ago, considering he had ran off to Canada with his girlfriend, now wife. With the map spread out over his lap, Donnie would tell me the directions to go since his driving shift had ended about an hour ago when we crossed Toronto. It was nighttime, and we both enjoyed the almost clear of traffic roads. We pulled into the next gas station, filled up, and went back on our way. Now I really don't know what happened next. I don't know if Donnie misread the map or if the road was supposed to go off into a back road, but it did. Donnie was sure it was right, but in the back of my mind I was sure there was an alternative. Easier way to get to Ray's than having this dark foresty road under our tires. There were no street lights, and it was so dark out that the headlights were barely making anything more than 15 feet visible. As Donnie munched on some potato chips, I began to get annoyed at this road that seemed to be getting smaller as we went on. Once I realized that it was starting to get smaller, I also realized that we kept passing this weird figure every 5 minutes. Every time we passed the figure, it seemed to be more illuminated each time. Donnie, starting to get more interested in paying attention to the map and where he screwed up, kept missing it. With the road still getting seemingly smaller, we made it to a fully illuminated version of this thing I'd been seeing. It was a human figure made of plaster, faceless too. Donnie saw it this time, so I wasn't crazy. I sped up a little and the sick feeling in my stomach began to get even worse. All of this could have been harmless or just a coincidence, but my conscience was telling me otherwise. At this point, the road is like a little driveway, and aside from the figures, we see a little bit of light in the distance. I press on the gas even faster than I have been and approach the lights. The road becomes non-existent and grassy as we pull up to the lights that turn out to be a diner sign on an old building. Did we just follow some insanely long driveway to a creepy diner in the middle of the woods? I guess so. We see people inside, and ignoring the growing fear in our bodies, we head in to ask for directions and see where Donnie messed up. Once we walk through the door, a terrible smell hits us hard, and the light bulbs were humming. I turn to where I saw the group of people and my stomach drops. I am looking at a group of mannequins, dirty, creepy mannequins with paint chipping off, all set up like we are in a life-size dollhouse. One mannequin was a child sitting in the booth eating fake corn on the cob, smiling at his mother mannequin. The third is standing there, I'm assuming, playing the part of the waitress. Donnie looked at me with the most terrified look, and I can tell his stomach dropped as far as mine. We then realized that whatever this place was had been closed for years, but someone still lived here due to the lights working and the place being clear of most dust and dirt. At this point, I wish I could say we bolted out of there and floored it the whole way back to where we came from, but I can't. Donnie and I both made eye contact and ran back over to the door as fast as we could, but soon realized that the door was locked and saw a shadow pass over the wall at that moment. My heart was pounding up through my mouth and I couldn't think straight. There could still be a chance that this creepy mannequin keeper was a nice hillbilly who was just playing a trick on us idiots, right? Wrong. Once I set my eyes on the figure walking toward me, my legs went weak and I had to fight with all I had to stay on my feet and not faint. Donnie grabbed my arm and I could feel his pulse through his fingers. The waitress mannequin, with the most unnerving, wide grin, moved towards us in a stiff totter, never missing a step. I stood there, still praying that this was all a practical joke, but when the monster put its cold, glass-like hands around my neck, choking me to the point where I couldn't see clearly, I knew we were somewhere you only read about in books. Right as I was about to fall out of consciousness, I hear something shattering and I hear Donnie telling me to wake up. The next thing I know, I am back on that small road lined with figures in the passenger seat of the Impala. I look at Donnie and his eyes, red with tears, are set on the road, and his foot is flat to the floor on the pedal. I see glass shards in his arm, so I assume he broke through the door. I can't talk, so I just look outside and stare, trying to figure out if what just happened really happened. I look at one of the plaster figures and pass out again when I see that it has the same grin as the mannequin. When I wake up, we are back on the highway and we made it back to Ann Arbor a few hours later. I stayed at Donnie's that whole week in fear of going home, and we barely spoke 2 words to each other. We called Ray and said we couldn't make it due to car troubles. Again, even after getting choked by some humanoid mannequin, I wish I could say that after going through that and escaping, that was that. But it isn't. Every 27th of the month, I hear a humming noise coming from outside my house. I don't look outside anymore because I know who is there. The waitress. She comes to my house and stiffly walks around my yard in a circle, but never facing away from the windows. She grins and I can hear overpowering maniacal laughter in my head. This goes on for hours. The good thing is my wife can't see or hear anything, so the only thing that keeps me sane is forcing myself to think that I am insane.